Four friends, James, Emily, Sarah, and Luke, lived in the small town of Bridgewater, a quiet place in Somerset, England. Life in Bridgewater was peaceful, but that wasn't enough for the four thrill-seeking friends. They craved adventure and often found themselves drawn to dark, mysterious places. It was James who first brought up the idea of visiting St. Margaret's Church, a long-abandoned chapel hidden deep in the woods outside town. Margaret's had a dark reputation. Once a thriving church, it was abandoned nearly 50 years ago after a series of gruesome events, disappearances, strange deaths, and the final blow, the sudden death of the church's priest, Father Hargrove, under mysterious circumstances. The townsfolk whispered that St. Margaret's was cursed, and no one had dared to go near it since. The building was now rotting away, overtaken by nature, and the woods surrounding it had grown thick and wild, making it nearly impossible to reach. But that didn't stop James from convincing the group to go. His plan was to use a Ouija board to try and contact the spirits rumored to haunt the place. Emily, Sarah, and Luke were reluctant at first, but the idea of a terrifying adventure was too tempting to resist. They set a date for the weekend and gathered the necessary supplies: a Ouija board, a pack of candles, and their mobile phones. The night finally arrived, cold and damp, as fog rolled in from the nearby moors. James picked everyone up in his old car, and they drove the few miles to the edge of the woods. The journey through the dark, winding forest was eerie enough, but nothing could prepare them for the sight of St. Margaret's when they finally reached it. The stone walls were crumbling, and vines snaked up the building like skeletal hands, gripping the decaying structure. "This is it," James said, parking the car a few yards from the overgrown entrance. His voice was brimming with excitement, but there was a nervous edge to it as well. "Looks like something out of a horror movie," Luke muttered as they climbed out of the car. Emily hugged her jacket tighter around her. "I don't know if this is a good idea." Sarah, the quietest of the group, didn't say anything. Her eyes were fixed on the church, as if it was staring back at her. "Come on, it's just an old building," James said, trying to sound confident. "Nothing's going to happen. We're just here for fun." With their candles, Ouija board, and phones in hand, the group slowly made their way into the church. The door was long gone, leaving a gaping black hole where it used to be. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and rot. The once beautiful stained glass windows were shattered, and moonlight filtered in through the broken panes, casting eerie patterns on the stone floor. The pews were overturned and covered in dust. A large wooden crucifix still hung on the wall behind the altar, but it was tilted at a strange angle, as if it had been pushed. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's get this over with," Emily added, glancing around nervously. James led them to the center of the church, where they cleared a small space on the floor and set up the Ouija board. They placed the candles in a circle around them, their flickering flames casting a dull glow on the old stone walls. The silence of the church was suffocating, as if it were waiting for something. "All right, everyone ready?" James asked, pulling out his phone to record the session. Luke swallowed hard, nodding. "Let's do it." They sat in a circle, knees touching, and placed their fingers lightly on the planchette, the small heart-shaped piece of wood used to guide the answers on the board. The Ouija board was an old one, borrowed from James's older cousin, who had dabbled in the occult. It had an aged, weathered look, as if it had been used many times before. "Are we really doing this?" Emily asked, her voice quivering. "It's just a game," James replied, but even he didn't sound so sure anymore. "Okay," he continued, taking a deep breath. "Let's start. Spirits of St. Margaret's, if you can hear us, we ask you to speak to us. Are you here?" The planchette sat still on the board, unmoving under their fingers. The four friends exchanged uneasy glances. "Maybe you have to be more specific," Luke suggested, his voice betraying the nervousness they all felt. James cleared his throat. "Father Hargrove, if you can hear us, we wish to speak with you. Please show us a sign." For a few moments, nothing happened. The only sound was the faint rustle of wind through the broken windows. Then, without warning, the planchette jerked, sliding across the board. "Is someone moving it?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "No," Emily whispered, wide-eyed. I swear I'm not. The planchette moved slowly, deliberately, spelling out a word, D-I-E. What the hell? Luke said, pulling his hand back from the planchette. James grinned nervously. It's probably just a coincidence. But then the planchette started moving again, this time faster, more erratically. It spelled out another word, L-E-A-V-E. I think we should listen, Emily said, her face pale. But James wasn't ready to give up. Father Hargrove, why do you want us to leave? What happened here? The planchette stopped moving. The air around them felt heavy, oppressive. Suddenly, the candles flickered wildly as if blown by an unseen force. Then, in one violent motion, all the candles went out, plunging the church into complete darkness. James, Emily shouted, her voice trembling. Light your phone. I can't see anything. James fumbled for his phone, the screen lighting up their terrified faces. The room was eerily quiet, too quiet. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, echoing through the church as if someone or something was walking down the aisle. The sound was coming closer. Who's there? Luke shouted, his voice cracking with fear. No answer. The footsteps continued, slow and steady, inching closer and closer. The four friends huddled together, frozen with terror. They pointed their phone lights toward the back of the church, but there was nothing there. Only the sound of those relentless footsteps, coming closer and closer. Suddenly, there was a loud crash. One of the pews toppled over, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Emily screamed, grabbing onto Sarah. James stood, clutching the Ouija board. We need to get out of here, Sarah cried, her eyes wide with fear. They scrambled to their feet, panic overtaking them as they stumbled toward the exit. But just as they reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The force of it rattled the entire building. We're trapped, Luke yelled, pounding on the door. It won't open. James frantically shined his phone light around the room, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. There's got to be another way out. But before they could move, the air grew cold, unnaturally cold. Frost began to form on the floor, creeping up the walls like icy fingers. Emily started to shiver uncontrollably, her teeth chattering as she clutched her arms. The footsteps returned, louder this time, as if whatever was in the church with them was angry. The sound echoed all around them, impossible to pinpoint. Suddenly, Luke let out a gasp. Look, he pointed to the crucifix on the wall behind the altar. It was moving, slowly rotating until it was upside down. The sight of it filled the room with a palpable sense of dread. This isn't right, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. We need to go, now. In a panic, they all rushed toward the windows. James grabbed a loose stone from the floor and hurled it at the nearest window, shattering it. Without hesitation, they climbed through, cutting their hands and legs on the broken glass as they scrambled outside. The night air hit them like a wave, cold and damp. They ran through the woods, not daring to look back, the sound of footsteps following them until they reached the safety of the car. James fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he finally started the engine. They sped away from St. Margaret's, not stopping until they were miles from the church. None of them spoke on the drive back to Bridgewater, too shaken by what they had experienced. But one thing was clear. They would never return to St. Margaret's, and they would never play with the Ouija board again. As they reached the outskirts of town, Emily broke the silence. What do you think that was? James didn't answer. He knew, deep down, that they had awoken something in St. Margaret's, something dark and dangerous. But some questions are better left unanswered. Story number 2. The clock on the wall flickered, its neon glow casting an eerie light over the empty aisles of Bennington's department store. It was well past midnight, and Emily was stuck on the last shift of her week. The store had closed hours ago, and she was left to count the inventory and prepare for the morning crew. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, flickering slightly as she pushed a cart filled with returned items down the aisle. The store was cavernous at night, the shelves towering over her like silent giants. Emily often found the vastness comforting, but tonight it felt different. A sense of unease settled in her stomach as she pushed the cart past rows of empty racks. She glanced at her phone, 1:15 a.m. The world outside was still and quiet, the only sound coming from the occasional clatter of her cart wheels against the tiled floor. As she moved through the clothing section, a chill ran down her spine. She shook her head, trying to dispel the creeping feeling that she wasn't alone. "Just a few more hours," she muttered to herself, forcing a smile. "You can do this." Emily turned her attention to the women's clothing racks, carefully inspecting each item for damages. She moved methodically, humming a soft tune to keep her mind occupied. But the more she focused, the more the sensation of being watched intensified. She glanced around, her heart pounding, but there was nothing unusual, just rows of clothes hanging silently. A loud crash echoed from the back of the store, and Emily froze, her breath hitching in her throat. The sound had come from the storage area, where the stock was kept. She shook her head again, convincing herself it was just the sound of falling boxes. "Get a grip, Em," she whispered to herself. "It's just the store settling." She took a deep breath and continued her work, but the unease lingered. The lights flickered again, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was in the store with her. The store had a long history. It had opened in the late 1970s, and rumors circulated about strange occurrences over the years. Employees had spoken of unsettling experiences during the night shifts, things going missing, odd noises, and fleeting glimpses of movement out of the corner of their eyes. Emily had always dismissed these tales as nothing more than urban legends meant to scare new hires. But tonight, she wasn't so sure. After a while, Emily decided to take a break. She headed to the break room, pouring herself a cup of coffee and trying to calm her nerves. As she sipped, she glanced out the window, but all she could see was her own reflection staring back at her. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was a text from her friend Jenna. "You okay?" "Heard there was a storm coming." Emily replied quickly, reassuring her that she was fine. But as she hit send, a loud thump resonated from the front of the store, followed by a series of rapid footsteps. Emily's heart raced. "Hello?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. There was no answer, only silence. She stood still, straining her ears to catch any sign of life, but the store remained eerily quiet. With a deep breath, Emily set her coffee down and walked cautiously toward the front of the store, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps had ceased, and now it felt like the entire store was holding its breath. Maybe it was a customer, she thought, although it was nearly impossible for anyone to be there at this hour. As she reached the front, she peered through the glass doors. The parking lot was empty, illuminated only by the flickering street lamp. Just as she was about to turn back, she noticed a figure standing in the far corner of the lot, just beyond the reach of the light. The figure was dressed in dark clothing, their face hidden in the shadows. "Hey!" Emily shouted, but the figure didn't move. Her voice echoed off the walls, and for a moment, she felt a chill run down her spine. "Get it together, Em," she muttered to herself, but unease twisted in her stomach. She returned to her tasks, pushing her cart through the electronics section. The faint glow of television screens illuminated the area, casting an odd light that made the products look almost alive. As she moved deeper into the aisles, the flickering lights overhead began to stutter more frequently, as if something was interfering with the electrical systems. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging the store into darkness. Emily froze, her breath quickening as panic gripped her. She fumbled for her phone, using its light to navigate through the aisles. "Hello?" she called again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anyone there?" The silence was deafening, only the sound of her own heartbeat ringing in her ears. She stumbled toward the emergency exit, but before she reached it, the lights flickered back on. When they illuminated the store again, something caught her eye. There, at the end of the electronics aisle, stood the figure from the parking lot, but now they were inside the store, staring directly at her. "Who are you?" she shouted, backing away slowly. The figure didn't respond, only tilting their heads slightly as if studying her. Emily turned to run, but collided with a display rack, sending items crashing to the ground. She quickly scrambled to her feet, but when she looked back, the figure was gone. Panic surged through her veins. She darted toward the front of the store, hoping to reach the exit and escape whatever was happening. But as she approached, the automatic doors wouldn't budge. "Come on," she yelled, pounding on the glass. They remained locked tight. She turned around, searching for another way out, but the store seemed to have transformed into a maze, the aisles shifting and twisting in ways she didn't recognize. It was as if the very layout of the department store was conspiring against her. "Stay calm, just think," she whispered to herself, trying to stave off the rising tide of fear. She recalled the layout of the store from her training. If she could just make it to the back exit, she could escape. With a determined breath, Emily raced toward the back of the store, her phone light illuminating her path. She glanced back over her shoulder, half expecting to see the figure pursuing her, but there was nothing. As she reached the stockroom, she yanked the door open and slipped inside, shutting it behind her. The stockroom was dimly lit, boxes piled high, and the air felt heavy. She could hear her own breathing echoing in the stillness as she tried to collect herself. "Okay, Emily, just breathe," she said, gripping the edge of a shelf. She felt a moment of calm, but then the sensation of being watched returned, more intense than before. She turned to scan the room but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just stacks of boxes and the flickering fluorescent lights. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Suddenly, a loud bang came from the stockroom door, causing her to jump. "Emily!" a voice called from the other side. It was Sarah, the store manager. "Sarah!" Emily cried, rushing to the door. "Get me out of here!" "Hold on!" Sarah shouted, her voice muffled. "I'll get it open." Emily's heart raced as she waited, the sound of pounding footsteps approaching from behind her. She turned around to see the figure emerging from the shadows, their face obscured but their intent clear. "Open the door!" Emily yelled, pounding her fists against it. "Just a second!" Sarah replied, struggling with the lock. The figure advanced slowly, and Emily backed away, panic flooding her mind. "Hurry, please!" she screamed, but Sarah's voice faded as the door swung open. Emily stumbled out into the main part of the store, her eyes wide with terror. "Close it! Close it!" she shouted, and Sarah slammed the door shut behind them. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her eyes darting around. There was someone in the store. But before Emily could finish, the lights flickered again, and the figure appeared behind Sarah, standing just outside the stockroom door. "Look out!" Emily screamed, but it was too late. The figure lunged forward, grabbing Sarah and pulling her back into the stockroom. Emily reached for her, but was too far away. "Help me!" Sarah's voice echoed, but the door slammed shut, cutting off any chance of rescue. "No!" Emily pounded on the door, but it held firm. She felt helpless as she listened to the struggle inside, the sounds of a desperate fight echoing through the air. Thinking quickly, she grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and smashed it against the door, trying to force it open. She could hear Sarah's cries growing fainter, drowned out by the noise of the figure overpowering her. Finally, the door cracked open, and Emily slipped inside just as the figure turned toward her. They were taller than she expected, dressed in dark, tattered clothing, their face hidden beneath a hood. A glint of metal caught her eye, a knife. "Get away from her!" Emily yelled, brandishing the fire extinguisher like a weapon. The figure lunged at her, and in a split-second decision, Emily swung the extinguisher, striking them hard across the face. They staggered back, momentarily disoriented, and Emily seized the opportunity to grab Sarah's hand. "Let's go!" she shouted, pulling her friend with all her strength. They dashed back toward the exit, adrenaline coursing through their veins. The figure recovered quickly, barreling after them, but Emily and Sarah reached the main entrance. "Help!" Emily screamed as they pounded on the locked doors, but there was no one to hear them. "Emily, we have to get to the back!" Sarah cried, pointing to the emergency exit sign illuminating the far wall. With no time to waste, they sprinted toward it. Emily glanced back just as the figure lunged again, their knife glinting in the harsh light. "Go!" Emily yelled, pushing Sarah ahead of her. They barreled through the door, slamming it shut behind them and locking it just in time. Breathless and terrified, they found themselves in the narrow corridor leading to the loading dock. The emergency exit door creaked ominously behind them, but they didn't stop to look back. "Where do we go now?" Sarah gasped, her voice shaking. "There's a truck outside. We can call for help," Emily urged. leading the way down the dimly lit corridor. As they reached the loading dock, Emily fumbled for her phone, her hands trembling. She glanced up just in time to see the figure emerge from the back door, a dark silhouette against the faint light of the loading bay. "Run!" Emily shouted, her heart racing as they sprinted toward the exit. They burst through the doors and stumbled into the night air, the cool breeze hitting their faces. Emily quickly pulled out her phone and dialed 911, but as she turned around to guide Sarah toward the truck, the figure was right there, blocking their path. "Get away!" Emily shouted, raising her phone like a weapon. But before she could react, the figure lunged, their knife aimed directly at her. Emily ducked just in time, and the knife grazed her arm, leaving a deep cut. "Emily!" Sarah screamed, grabbing her friend and pulling her back. "Keep running!" Emily shouted, pain surging through her arm as they darted toward the truck parked nearby. They reached it just as the figure recovered and came after them again. Emily scrambled for the door, yanking it open and practically throwing Sarah inside. "Start the engine!" she yelled, and Sarah fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. As the figure approached, Emily grabbed a nearby metal rod, brandishing it as a makeshift weapon. "Get in!" she shouted again, her heart racing. Finally, the engine roared to life, and Sarah threw the truck into reverse, narrowly missing the figure as they lunged forward. "Drive!" Emily yelled, gripping the metal rod tightly. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her, the fear threatening to overwhelm her. Sarah slammed the truck into drive and sped away from the loading dock, leaving the figure behind as they disappeared into the darkness. "Did we lose them?" Sarah panted, her eyes wide with terror as they sped down the empty road. "I don't know," Emily replied, glancing back at the store, the looming structure growing smaller in the distance. "But we can't stop. We have to get to safety." As they drove further away, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by exhaustion and pain. Emily felt the sting of her injury and the weight of everything that had happened. But as they raced into the night, she knew one thing for certain. This was a night she would never forget. Emily and Sarah drove on, adrenaline still coursing through their veins, both shaken and relieved to have escaped the terror that had lurked within the walls of Bennington's department store. My name is David. I'm 24 years old, and I live in Ridge Hollow, a quiet and isolated farming community nestled deep in the Midwest. My family owns a small piece of land, and while it's peaceful most days, the isolation can be unsettling. My parents want me to take over the farm when they retire, but I've always dreamed of leaving this small town behind, especially after the eerie events of last summer. It was mid-July, a quiet week when my parents went on a much-needed vacation. That left me and my two younger sisters, Lisa and Emma, in charge of the farm. Lisa was always busy with her online classes, leaving Emma and me to manage the rest. It was a hot, dry evening when the strange things began. That night, Emma and I were in the living room, watching TV while Lisa worked in her room. The dogs, Rusty and Blue, suddenly went wild outside. The farm dogs usually barked at small critters, but this was different. Their deep, frantic barking sent chills down my spine. Something had disturbed them. "I'll check it out," I muttered, grabbing a flashlight. Emma looked concerned but didn't stop me. I stepped outside into the cool night, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The dogs were facing the cornfield, snarling and growling like they were ready to fight. I squinted, trying to see what they were barking at, but all I could hear was a soft whistle, a human whistle, coming from deep within the corn. Every hair on my neck stood up. I didn't dare venture into the field alone, so I hurried back inside to grab the shotgun my father kept for protection. When I told Emma what I'd heard, her face paled. "Don't go out there," she said, her voice shaky. "Just leave it. It's probably nothing." But it didn't feel like nothing. With the shotgun in hand, I returned to the porch and fired a shot into the air, hoping to scare off whoever was out there. The shot echoed through the night, silencing the dogs momentarily. I stood there, listening intently. For a moment, everything was still. Then the dogs started barking again, even more frenzied than before. I swung the flashlight toward the cornfield and felt my stomach drop. A man was standing at the edge of the field, just beyond the reach of the light. His silhouette was barely visible, but I could see the glint of his eyes as he stared at me. Without thinking, I shouted, "Get off our land!" He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped backward into the corn, disappearing without a sound. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to the house. I wasn't about to chase some stranger into the field in the dead of night. Inside, I told Emma and Lisa what had happened. Lisa insisted we call the police, but Ridge Hollow was so remote that it would take them over an hour to reach us. We decided to stay indoors and keep the doors locked. I brought the dogs inside, hoping their presence would calm our nerves. As the night wore on, I found it hard to sleep. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of the wind outside. I had the shotgun by my bed, just in case. Around midnight, I heard it again, the same slow, eerie whistling, this time much closer. I shot out of bed and ran to the window. There he was, standing in the moonlight, just a few feet from the front porch. He wasn't moving, just standing there and staring up at my window. His face was shadowed, but I could see the faint outline of a grin. I grabbed the shotgun and aimed it through the window. My hands were shaking, but I pulled the trigger, firing a warning shot at the ground near his feet. He flinched, but didn't run. Instead, he took one slow step toward the house, then another. My blood ran cold. This wasn't some prank. I fired another shot, this time closer. That finally made him turn and dart back into the cornfield. I waited, heart racing, hoping he wouldn't return. But something about the way he moved, calm and deliberate, told me he would. The hours dragged on, and just as I was starting to doze off, I heard the dogs growling low from the hallway. I sprang up, clutching the shotgun. I moved toward the front door, stepping as quietly as possible. The whistling was back, this time right outside the house. It wasn't just one voice now, there were two, maybe three. "Lisa, Emma," I hissed, waking my sisters. "Get to the basement now." They didn't argue. We all hurried downstairs, locking the door behind us. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, shotgun ready. The whistling stopped. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the creak of footsteps on the porch. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the front door. My heart thundered in my chest as I pointed the gun at the door, ready to fire. Another knock, then silence. I don't know how long we stayed huddled in the basement, waiting for something to happen. Finally, the footsteps retreated, fading into the night. By dawn, I crept upstairs to check the house. Everything seemed normal. The front door was locked, no signs of forced entry. But when I stepped outside, my blood ran cold. In the soft dirt of the yard, just beneath my bedroom window, were several sets of footprints. They were large, unmistakably human, and led right to the door. Whoever they were, they had been watching us all night. And they were never alone. I packed my bags the next day. My sisters and I never found out who the men were or what they wanted, but I couldn't stay on the farm after that. Whatever Ridge Hollow used to be, it wasn't safe anymore. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. Thank you, friends, for listening to the stories. Hope you enjoyed them. Please subscribe for more scary stories in the future.